Welcome to page 20 of Anatomy Coloring Book. This is Dr. Stephen Harkins. And today we'll talk about joints, how to classify joints. So there are many different types of joints in the human body. There are the fibrous types of joints, the cartilaginous joints, the synovial joints, I would say the most common. Then we're going to talk about the types of synovial joints. Down here, these types of synovial joints. Let's start first with the fibrous joints. You may not be aware of this, but there are joints in the skull of your head. For example, right here, where this occipital bone of the skull meets these parietal bones here. Occipital bones and parietal bones and the temporal bone. And they are connected via a suture joint. This squiggly little joint, and it is considered to be immovable, at least in the fully grown adult. There is some debate about that, but when we are children and infants, the soft spot on a baby's head is a place where these sutures have not yet come together, and it forms a gap or a soft spot in the baby's head. So they fuse later in life, and they are considered a joint, an immovable fibrous joint. Teeth also sit in a socket. Here you go, right over here. And it's called a gomphosis joint. And it is a type of fibrous joint, an immovable, basically immovable fibrous joint. Also, this slightly or partly movable joint called a syndesmosis in between the radius and ulna of the forearm. When you rotate your forearm up and down, there's a ligament in between the two called the interosseous ligament, and that's considered a type of fibrous joint as well. We've talked recently about the epiphyseal plate here. This growth plate in between of cartilage, where the cartilage is where there are osteoblasts laying down new bone in this area here, in this cartilage area, and growing the bones outward. Well, that's actually considered an immovable cartilage joint as well, cartilaginous joint. And these are the vertebrae of the spine. Here's your back right here. And deep in your back, in between your vertebrae, there are these fibrocartilaginous discs. Your vertebral disc, you've heard about disc herniations. These are partly movable cartilaginous joints made of fibrocartilage. Right here, cartilaginous joints made of fibrocartilage. Partly movable, the intervertebral disc, and also the sacroiliac joint, which we'll learn about later. Also, the pubic symphysis in front of your pelvic ring, we'll learn about later as well, has a little fibrocartilaginous joint in there as well. Now on to the most common type of joint in the body, or the type that you're most familiar with. For example, the elbow down here, the shoulder, the elbow, this metacarpal phalangeal joint of the thumb, the joints of the wrist, the joints of the upper neck, this gliding joint of the acromioclavicular, all different types of synovial joints. Why are they called synovial? Well, they are freely movable joints. And let's talk about their anatomy. Well, first you have two articulating bones. Let's say bone A and bone B here. Two articulating bones that come together. And what you see right here is this cartilage, this articulating cartilage. Very, very slippery, slippery cartilage. Again, synovial joints are freely moving, so they need to be almost friction-free. And this slippery surface in here is so slippery that there's almost no friction whatsoever in these joints because of this really slippery articular cartilage. Now, moving outward, this little layer right here is called the synovial membrane. Synovial membrane, and that's why these are called synovial joints. And the synovial membrane creates an airtight capsule, and there's fluid, and it puts out fluid. This membrane puts fluid into this little cavity, the synovial cavity here. And it's a very, very slippery fluid that is in between the joints as well. So a slippery surface here, a slippery surface here, and then a slippery fluid makes for a very, very friction-free joint, and it allows for that freely movable joint. And this is the synovial cavity fluid that is released, that is created by the synovial membrane. Now, surrounding the synovial membrane is a structure called the joint capsule. And it is this fibrous structure here surrounding the synovial membrane that is called the fibrous capsule, or the capsule, the articular capsule, the joint capsule. There you go. Or you could say that the synovial membrane is the inner lining of the joint capsule. And then outside of that, this very, very tough ligament, in this case it would be the knee or the elbow, called a collateral ligament, but very, very tough, strong ligament attaching to the bone up here of, let's say this is the humerus, or excuse me, the femur, and it travels all the way down here and attaches to the humerus or the tibia. And this would be, say, a medial collateral ligament, for example. And this out here might be a lateral collateral ligament. But a very, very tough ligament that is hard to stretch and hard to tear. Of course, you hear people tearing these in sports, the MCL, the LCL, but a very tough protective ligament that keeps the joint from bending too far in this direction. If it senses that the joint's being pushed in this direction, it will resist that motion and keep the joint surfaces together and keep it from, well, stretching or breaking or dislocating. And then finally, there's this little structure in here, this little structure. Anytime there are friction surfaces, this little structure here, a little gap. There's a little gap between the ligament and the joint capsule. And this little gap you've heard of before because people say it all the time. I have bursitis. This is called a bursa. It's a little sac that is similar, I suppose, to the synovial joint, the synovial cavity with the synovial membrane. But it's in between in high friction areas. And you'll find it surrounding many of the joints of the body where there is high friction, or one surface kind of rubbing against another, or a place that might be prone to pressure or friction, and it provides an extra padding, and it too is filled with fluid. And when the bursa inflames, that fluid, can grow out here, and you might have, bursitis. Now let's talk about the types of synovial joints, these freely movable joints. We're not talking about sutures anymore, or epiphyseal plates, or discs. We're talking about these very common joints in the body. For example, the humerus, the glenohumeral joint right here, and here's your scapula right here. And it's kind of a ball and socket joint, and you can see the freedom of movement that a ball and socket joint has. It can rotate to the right, to the left. It can sort of laterally flex and bend, and it can move in all different directions, the ball and socket joint. The hip, the shoulder are examples, and the movements permitted are flexion, extension, adduction, abduction, internal and external rotation, and circumduction. All the movements are allowed. In other words, you can take your shoulder, you can raise it up, you can rotate it, you can bring it behind your back, in front of your torso, above your head, and this arm can rotate down, it can rotate up, rotating around in this direction or back. It's a ball and socket joint, and you can see why. The ball of the humerus here and the socket of the scapula. Ball, the socket put together. The next type of joint is the simple hinge joint, for example, in the elbow. The elbow is similar to this hinge, this door hinge right here, and that it can, at least the radial or the humero-ulnar joint can only essentially move in one plane, flexion and extension. The elbow joint can go up and it can go down. It can flex and it can extend. And those are the two basic movements of the humero-ulnar joint, the humero-ulnar joint, the humerus and the ulna. And it has essentially one movement. So the ankle also works that way, essentially one movement. The interphalangeal joints, that's the joints of your fingers. They only move in one direction. And moving on to saddle joints. Now, the saddle joint, the carpo-metacarpal joint. Here's your metacarpal joint. Here's your metacarpal bone of your thumb. And then here is your carpal joint of the wrist. And they interact on this sort of biplanar motion, I guess you could say. It's almost like two hinge joints put together. And they allow, accordingly, all the motions but rotation. You can't spin this joint around this way, but you can certainly move it here, 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 and here, but it can't rotate on an axis. That's called a saddle joint. Ellipsoid joints is also known as a condylar joint. You'll see right here, condyloid or condylar joint. And it's kind of a reduced ball and socket, not very pronounced like this ball and socket, but sort of a flattened ball and socket where sort of a curved surface here with maybe, this is the knee I'm doing right here, with a curved surface right here. And this is essentially what, say, a knee joint looks like. A bicondylar knee joint, meaning two condyles, 1, 2, a bicondylar joint. That's what we're saying right here. Rotation is minimal. There is some we're rotating around this, but mostly it has flexion and extension going backward and forward. And so it's essentially, as is this joint here, a condylar kind of joint, a very reduced ball and socket. In this example here, this might be ball and this might be the socket. See, a very reduced version of this. Okay. And that is your ellipsoid or condylar joint. And here, found in the neck, in the upper neck, we have a joint called the pivot joint. There's really only one of them in the body, maybe two. There's another one kind of in the elbow area right here called the radial ulnar joint, where the only motion that's allowed is rotation. Whereas there was no rotation over here, say in a saddle joint, that's the only rotation that's allowed, the motion that's allowed in this pivot joint. And it's at the level of the atlas and the axis, or C1 and C2. It kind of looks like this, and I'll do my best to make a drawing here. Let's see, maybe from the side, C2, the axis vertebra looks maybe something like this. And it's got a part that called the dens that pops up like that. And then there's another vertebra, C1, that's C2. Let's see, this is C2 here. There's another vertebra, C1, that's shaped kind of like this, and it goes around, and it has a little wing on it back here. Anyway, it's like they call it the hole-in-one joint. I'm doing a poor job of drawing this, but from the top it looks like this. There's this part protruding upward, this dens of C2, and then there is the axis vertebra that is surrounding it like this, and this vertebra spins, is able to turn around that protrusion called the dens of the C2 vertebra. So this is C1 here. Horrible job drawing the C1 here. Spinning around that mass, this mass called the dens right here, from the C2 vertebra. Spinning around it. There we go, something like that. And that's called a pivot joint. And another place is the radio-ulnar joint of the, let's say here's the ulna of the arm. It's got a little round protrusion right there. And then there's another bone called the radius. It goes like this. And this bone kind of spins and turns around and this little surface area right here. This surface area. So it creates a little spinning motion. So that's the radio-ulnar joint. And it is a pivot or rotating joint, rotating only. It doesn't slide this way, it doesn't slide that way for the most part. It just spins. It's a pivot joint. Now, a gliding joint, an example of gliding is in the facets of the vertebra here, right in here. They're kind of slanted like this on top of each other. And when the person flexes forward, these two surfaces right here slide on one another. And in a translational fashion, like this, it'll move up this way and back that way on this surface here, a sliding or translating surface. So it's called a gliding joint. Also the acromioclavicular joint, the AC joint, right in your shoulder there. You've heard of a separated shoulder. That's what happens there. And you can see the example of two surfaces right here gliding on one another, up, down, and sideways. But obviously you can see there's no rotation allowed in this joint, a gliding joint. It's simply a sliding and a gliding. So obviously the most mobile joint is the ball and socket here, possibly in the ellipsoid. And then the limited hinge, which is only flexion extension, the saddle hat, which has a couple more degrees of movement. And then of course the strictly sliding, the strictly rotating pivot joint, and then the strictly sliding gliding joint. So, and that's a summary of the classification of the joints of the human body. I'm Dr. Stephen Harkins. This is page 20 of Anatomy Coloring Book. Until next time.